if you're involved in a government investigation, may go to federal prison, you want to know all opportunities to potentially get home quicker, which means you are going to learn about the First Step Act. And that's what I want to talk about today with my friend Michael Santos. I'm Justin McPerney. Welcome to our channel. Like and subscribe if you find value. Michael, before we get into some of the specifics of the First Step Act, like what is the First Step Act and how did it originate?
That's a great question. And a lot of people who don't have experience in the system don't realize just how big of a piece of prison reform legislation that was. The First Step Act is the biggest piece of reform legislation that is taking place in the United States since 1987, when the laws changed from what's called an indeterminate sentencing system to a determinate sentencing system. It had a lot of influences, such as reducing the amount of good time that was available. Good time is really a misnomer. What it's really, a better name for it would be the avoidance of bad time. As long as you don't get in trouble, you get the time. But people would serve 85% of their sentences, and they didn't have many mechanisms throughout the journey to accelerate that path. Later, there was some reforms, like in 1994, they passed a bill that brought the RDAP program, which is the only program that existed up until the First Step Act that could accelerate a person's release date. But to qualify, a person had to have a documented history of substance abuse. The First Step Act, what it did is it really incentivized people to work toward earning freedom through merit. And it incorporated a number of provisions, such as time credits, which is a different form of time credit, which is a different form of credit for people who are doing something positive. It's a dynamic movement. And people who work through programs, if they qualify, will receive up to a year off of their sentence. But in addition to a year off of their sentence, they can qualify for accumulating credits that can lead to an earlier transition into home confinement or a community confinement setting. So it is a huge piece of reform legislation, because people with a 60-month sentence, for example, if everything goes right, they might be able to transition to home confinement in 19 or 20 months.
Well, when people come into the system for the first time, I know from experience, it moves so slow and it's just such a delayed process. But you've been through it for such a long time. It's actually made significant improvements because of the First Step Act and some of these changes.
It's huge changes. First Step Act was, because it was the biggest piece of prison reform legislation, that has many incentives besides the time credits. And not everybody qualifies.
Right.
Okay? That Congress made some offenses disqualifying. If you're not an American citizen, that doesn't qualify. It's part of the reform work that we try and change. But right now, the law is certainly better than what existed 10 years ago, but I believe it's going to get better in 5 years, and you do see these changes routinely. Because it was such a big piece of legislative reform, Congress gave the Bureau of Prisons 1 year before it even started to get implemented. They had to develop different risk assessment tools and so on and so forth, and they had to train staff. And then COVID delayed it. But right now, we have new leadership in the Bureau of Prisons that is really moving quickly to bring changes, and those changes are, in my view, are benefiting every person in federal prison.
So some of you watching this, I know, are going to be wondering, will you qualify? We do a free webinar every Tuesday where we will actually go to BOP.gov. We can put in qualifying or disqualifying offenses, along with a lot of helpful information if you want to join the free webinar on Tuesdays. Let's talk about when you began this idea of like incentivizing excellence or earning freedom. And I know the answer because I was in prison with you and you wrote this book called Earning Freedom. Help us understand how that is like a pathway to the First Step Act passing. What does that mean, earning freedom?
Well, first of all, I will say that there are many people that really advocated for change and had an influence. I started writing about it at a time when the Bureau of Prisons was very resistant to any of these kinds of changes. And earning freedom was one component in that advocacy effort to try and just introduce the concept of what we could do better, what could change. And with the book, then there were other steps that you would take to advocate, publishing in law review journals, speaking in judicial conferences, offering ideas, creating programs, and then eventually getting buy-in. So that's what started it. But it wasn't until President Trump's first term of office that he signed the bill into law. And that's what really started to change things. The history has been a long time in the making, but it's like a J-stick curve. It takes a lot of effort, but then you have a hockey stick approach. Right now, you have the correct leadership in place that is really advocating for these kinds of changes. And you'd mentioned disqualifying offenses. There is the First Step Act also provides discretion to BOP officials, and there are people that historically may not qualify for something because they have a high recidivism score or something along those lines. But there are other ways that the First Step Act an administrator could use the First Step Act to get a person closer to home or into a community confinement setting right now. And I'm seeing that, and I'm grateful to have a small role in trying to advance those initiatives.
So when I hear discretion, I think subjective. Some case manager or warden could have a decision to make. If someone who is not qualified, or what should someone do to position themselves? Like, hey, I'm going to prison. I can't believe I'm here, but I'm going. I want to be productive. I want to be one of those case studies where it's 60 months and I'm home in 18 or 20. How could someone begin to prepare for that?
Well, the first thing a person has to do is invest in himself. And I would always argue that a person has to really understand the lay of the land. Instead of complaining about what doesn't apply to him, figure out what can I do. And I'll give you an example on the First Step Act. Although time credits may have limitations with regard to disqualifying offenses, every person in federal prison who's convicted under the post November 1st, 1987, they all, for offenses that were committed after November the 1st, 1987, all of those people qualify for compassionate release, every one of them. Prior to the First Step Act, that wasn't the case. Prior to the First Step Act, a person did not have the ability to file for compassionate release. Only the BOP could file. And that's not the BOP's mission. So what can a person do? They can document why they're extraordinary and compelling. What did they do to advance them as a candidate for a higher level of liberty? And it's to understand, even though I may not be able to lower my prison sentence, I could still influence the warden on where they're going to place me. Okay, when a judge sentences a person to prison, he said, I sentence you to the custody of the Attorney General. The Attorney General delegates the custody to the Director of the Bureau of Prisons. And the Director of the Bureau of Prisons right now is using a lot of discretion on how to implement the First Step Act to reduce the number of people in prison and to increase the number of people who are functioning in society as law-abiding citizens, which I think is a phenomenal transition.
Can you talk about all the traveling you're doing to prisons from the perspective of how you mentioned in new administration, how staff is responding perhaps to you speaking in prisons and how they're interpreting the First Step Act changes? For example, on October 21st, there was a new BOP article. The title of the article is like Win for Prison Reform and People in Prison. How are they responding to these changes? And what are you seeing as you're going to all these prisons?
I think it's a win for all Americans, frankly. The president signed the bill with the expectations of improving outcomes of the system. Historically, that change is slow coming. I mean, he signed that law in 2018. It took several years before people started to get the benefits of that. There's always a funding complication. We're filming this video on Halloween, October the 31st, 2025, and staff members in the BOP have not been getting have been working, but haven't been getting paid. So there's always a budget crisis. There's always a complication. That said, there is a lot of movement on policy changes that will help people move from a high security prison to potentially earn a pathway to a medium security prison. Have people in a medium security prison earn a pathway to lower security prison. Have people in a lower security prison or a minimum security camp, if they're qualified, if they've built the record, if they've demonstrated that they are a good candidate, maybe to transition into a residential reentry center or home confinement. And that's what I expect to see more development on with work release programs, furlough programs.
So are those part of on the prisonprofessors.org site, you have the BOP, like the big push initiatives? Are these some of these?
So I'll tell you the history of that.
Yes.
So I, thanks to influential people, got an opportunity to travel to D.C. and meet with the Deputy Director, Josh Smith. When I met with him, he asked me a question. He said, what would you do if you were in my seat? And he said, and I want you to think big. think about what changes would you like to see made in the Bureau of Prisons. And if you look at the prisonvestors.org site, you could actually see the memorandums that I submitted back in July of 2025 and in August of 2025 to really kind of expand and elaborate on what I saw of helping people work to earn freedom based on their behavior, on the merit, on the efforts that they took to prepare. And you spoke about a memorandum that the agency recently published. Well, you'll see those things being carried out. And
Well, I saw some of that, and that's why I go back to that memo from the 21st on the BOP side, even referencing eligible people reducing security levels, saving money, better for the prison, better for the person. That's directly out of that memo.
And I know people in the agency that are doing things today that would have been, unheard of or unthinkable 10 years ago. I was traveling to a prison in the Midwest with a senior member of the Bureau of Prisons, and he was telling me stories of how a regional director was writing letters to get a person clemency because he believed in the person's record. So you're seeing, and I've met many wardens who've told me they've pursued clemency or advocated for somebody to get to home confinement or get time credits, even though they don't qualify under traditional mechanisms. So they're looking for pathways to exercise discretion. If a warden has reached that level of professional advancement, the director believes that warden should have some discretion on how to carry out the spirit of the First Step Act.
So as we wrap up this video, how could someone, I'd like you to talk about the .org and the ability that people have before they go to prison and while they're in prison to really be documenting their journey, sharing lessons, book reports, the bio, and how could that be of value to someone who's assessing if they're a candidate to go home earlier?
The types of reform that the director is pushing forward really depends a lot upon people in prison advancing their lives in such a way that shows they want to be responsible. They want to demonstrate, they want to build a path of being law-abiding, contributing citizens. And the harder a person works on himself, the more they advance the pathway to these types of initiatives. So I would say a person in prison does have to find out, how can I memorialize the journey? And thanks to your sponsorship from you and from others, we offer everything for free at Prison Professors. So people should go on there and build a profile. They should tell me their story. What is their biography? Not for me, but for the people that might have influence on whether they should advance as individuals as a candidate for liberty. They should write a journal entry. It's very easy in prison to complain and talk about why things aren't fair or why the system isn't doing what the system's supposed to do. But what's inspiring is when a person says, this is how I'm preparing myself. And if he can memorialize it, it advances him as a candidate for the outcome that he wants. You spoke about book reports. We talk about that because sometimes prisons don't have classes. They don't have courses, but they have books. And people should be reading books deliberately, intentionally, and showing why did this book influence their thinking or help them build a pathway for success. And finally, a release plan. Individuals should not wait for the system to write a release plan. The system doesn't know the complexity of this person's life. Every individual should learn how to do it himself and memorialize it and then build a body of assets or portfolio of assets that they could use in self-advocacy.
I want to close with some people who are cynical, who say, well, I may create this and they might not read it. Some people in our community create a plan. They go to prison. They feel like their case manager might put it in the trash or have no interest in it. They get very dejected. So help us understand the value of creating, even if that first asset or that first day doesn't influence someone to the. I can only imagine how much resistance you got when you went to prison. You didn't stop the first time you got some bad news from a case manager.
Yeah, prisons are not designed to give you hope, right? They're designed to carry out the order of the judge. And staff members are trained that is their responsibility, to carry out the order of the judge. Sometimes a person goes to prison and they forget that a case manager is not there to make his life easier. But what an individual has to do is consistently work on himself and advance himself as a shining light. As he's got to invest in his relationships. He's got to invest in building a total body of work that would cause other people not to see him for what it says in the PSR, but as somebody who is extraordinary and compelling. And yes, he should expect to face resistance. He should expect to have people say at various times, a federal judge sentenced you to 3 years, and we think you should serve 3 years, not 2 years and 11 months and 2 weeks, 3 years. But if a person has built something extraordinary and compelling, I think he's going to find that people will be more receptive to bringing forth change. And even if he finds somebody who's resistant or obstructive, he's got to focus on what he can do, because it's not only about being in prison, right? A prison journey also includes supervised release. It also includes recalibrating, getting ready for the job market, the credit market, the rejection he's going to face going forward. The harder he works on himself, though, the better he's going to make in a position. And I would always say, just as they say in the financial sector, if a strategic decision has a better than 1% chance of advancing the ball to success, take it. And that's all a person can do. Invest in himself to make himself a better candidate to get the best possible outcome.
So as we close, I know you've been to so many prisons. Where are you off to now? Where are the next?
Yeah, I've been to 15 prisons in the last 2 months. So it's like every week I'm on airplanes and hotels and rental cars. I'm off again. I was in Herlong, California earlier this week, but I go on a very long and demanding trip to Kentucky, leaving on Sunday, where I'll be in Ashland, Kentucky on Monday, USP Big Sandy on Tuesday, FCI Manchester on Wednesday, USP McCreary on Thursday, and then FMC Lexington on Friday. Then I fly home. I'm home for a couple of days. Then I'm off to Michigan, then off to Sheridan, Oregon, then off to Florence, Colorado, Inglewood. What's next after that? Just a series of airplanes, hotels, and I got a lot of points at the Hampton Inn.
Yeah, a lot of points. So if you'd like to learn more about the First Step Back, release plan, and all these things, I encourage you to join the weekly webinar every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. I'll put a link up in the description. It's good to spend time with you. Thank you.